Hello, my name is Alicia, and I made this video for a very simple reason, to help everyday people understand what their government is doing. It's been my experience that a lot of people watch the news and they hear about all of these things happening in government, but they don't really understand what it means or how it affects their lives, or even worse, they feel powerless to do anything about it. That said, this video is going to provide a really simplified overview of the structure of government so that the next time you're watching the news, you have some background as to who these people are and how it all works. So, firstly, what do we mean by national? The government is not just the government. You have a local government, which includes your mayor and the people that run your city, a state government, which includes your governor, and then the people that run that entire state. And then you have the national government, which includes the president and all of the people that help him or her run the country. The one we're going to discuss is that one, the big one. It's the one that rules over the 50 states and also supersedes any of the laws of your city or your state. Now, the red dot toward the top is Washington, D.C. It's unlike any other part of the country because it's not in any state in particular. It's a special territory that's designated as the country's capital. So this is where most of the national government operates and where you find places like the White House and Capitol Hill. The national government is split up into three equal branches. Now, don't get caught up on the term branches because it's not like saying a bank branch, for example. Instead, we can think of it as three parts of a whole or three sections in one system. The branches operate on a system that's called checks and balances, which basically means that each branch of government has some kind of power over the other branches of government. So let's take a look at Congress first. The US Congress is arguably the most important branch of the government because they're the ones that create the laws that essentially make the US what it is. You probably recognize this building from the back of a $50 bill. This is Capitol Hill, and this is where Congress meets. On the left side, you have what's called the lower house or the House of Representatives. In this room, you find 435 people, all of which have been elected by you, the people. After they're elected, they serve a 2-year term and they represent an area with 700,000 people. They're pretty special because they're the only ones that have the power to create tax laws, and more importantly, they also hold the power to impeach the president, which we'll talk about later. On the right side, you have the Senate, also known as the upper house. The Senate only has 100 senators as opposed to the House of Representatives, which has 435 people. Each senator has to be elected by you, the people, and they will serve for 6 years. Instead of representing only 700,000 people, they represent all of the people of their state. A very special power that they have is that they can ratify treaties. What does that mean? It means that they can put into action agreements that the president has negotiated with other countries. And also, very importantly, they're the ones that are in charge of conducting impeachment trials. And again, I'll explain what that means shortly. So let's take a look at the White House next. The White House is really part of what's called the executive branch. Now, if Congress was in charge of creating the laws, the executive branch, their job is to enforce the laws. And we can think of the executive branch in two parts, which is the White House and then all of the US departments. Now, in the White House, over here on this side, they have what's called the West Wing. Now, the West Wing is 3 stories high and has many, many offices in it, but we're going to talk about 2 offices that are quite important. The first one is the Oval Office. The Oval Office is where the president does the majority of his or her work. Now, the actual president, him or herself, is not elected by the people, unlike Congress. He or she is elected by what's called the Electoral College, but that's a tale for a different time. After they're elected, they serve for 4 years, and again, they're responsible for the application and the enforcement of laws. A very special power that the president has is the president has to sign laws before they go into effect, or he or she can veto laws. Veto just means they throw out the law or send it back to Congress, or just simply don't approve and do not want the law to go into place. There are ways around it, but generally the veto is very strong. And also, the president is the main person in charge of diplomacy, which means having conversations with other countries and negotiating deals with other countries. Now, the president doesn't work alone. In fact, the president works very closely with what's called the president's cabinet. The cabinet is just a group of people that include the vice president and the secretaries of other departments. And secretary is really just saying the person in charge, the head person in charge of other US departments. Examples of departments might include, the Department of Labor, which is the department in charge of everything related to work and labor inside the United States. They might be in charge of, the interior, and interior refers to national parks and our natural spaces. They might be in charge of education, and so they dictate all of the rules around education in the country. So all of these different departments are spread around Washington, D.C., and you can see them in these green buildings here. Now, this is just zoomed in to the area that's close to the White House, but there are many, many, many U.S. department buildings all over Washington, D.C. In fact, because of a lot of the traffic and tourism that happens in Washington, D.C., and also for safety reasons, they've built these underground tunnels so that people that work for the executive branch and other parts of the national government can actually travel through these underground tunnels. They have trains, some of them have walkways, and so on. Here are some examples of both departments and then agencies. Agencies really just means they are part of a department that are within Washington, D.C. One that is very famous is FEMA. You might see FEMA come out after a hurricane or earthquake, tornado, some sort of natural disaster, and they are part of the Department of National Security. Another one you might recognize is the FBI, which is an agency under the Department of Justice. And more recently in the news, because of the coronavirus crisis, there is the CDC, which is Center for Disease Control, and they're under the Department of Health and Human Services. There are also some agencies that are not part of any department. For example, NASA is independent. Same thing for the US Postal Service, and same thing for the CIA. The final branch we'll talk about is the judicial branch. So judicial branch really just refers to the courts. It's a system of federal courts, and their job is to interpret the law. So again, if Congress creates the laws, and the executive branch enforces the laws, then the judicial branch has to interpret the laws. The one that I want to talk about in the judicial branch is really the highest court. The highest court is called the Supreme Court. In the Supreme Court, you have these 9 justices that sit on the bench, and really justices is just a fancy way of saying judge. Each justice can not necessarily be hired into this position, but they are appointed by the president. They also cannot be elected by the people to be a justice. They have to be hand-selected. Once they're a justice, there are no term limits. They're going to be there until they retire or pass away or decide to move into a different line of work, though I don't know if that's ever happened. And as the highest court, their job is to listen to the most complicated cases. And often these cases have been through a series of lower courts before they finally get appealed, or brought into the highest one. One example is Brown versus the Board of Education. This Supreme Court case is famous because it found that segregation of white children and black children in schools was unconstitutional. Up until that point, they were under a system called separate but equal. But that fell apart because schools were separate, but they definitely weren't equal. Schools for black children were pretty under-resourced and really underfunded compared to schools for white children. In this particular case, the child that's sitting on the stairs lived very close to a school, but she could not attend that school because it was designated only for white children. She was instead forced to attend a school that was much further, which meant she had a longer walk and through a crime-infested neighborhood. Now, after losing the case in lower courts, her case was appealed to the Supreme Court, where her family and supporters were met with protests from groups that were wanting to prevent the mixing of races, proclaiming that it was communism. Thankfully, all 9 justices agreed that school segregation was indeed unconstitutional, and so schools across the nation were integrated. To me, that is truly the power of the Supreme Court. It doesn't matter what Congress or the president uh, create as law. If the Supreme Court deems it as unconstitutional, it sets a standard for going forward. So now that you understand what each branch does, let's talk about how each branch will do what's called a check on the other, which means we're going to discuss what power each one holds over the other. So we'll talk about Congress and the White House first. Now, as I mentioned very briefly on other slides, Congress has the power to impeach a president. So what does that mean? It means that members of the House of Representatives can accuse a president of crimes or some kind of misconduct, and they can take this person to trial. In recent years, it happened with Bill Clinton in the 90s, where he had an illicit affair with a White House intern, and so they wanted to essentially prosecute him for misconduct. And so they put together what are called the Articles of Impeachment, which really it's just a document that says this is what the president did, and the president has to answer for his or her crimes. Once they have these articles of impeachment together, they physically walk it across Capitol Hill to the other side where the Senate will hold a trial and the senators will vote for or against the removal of the president. This also happened very recently with Donald Trump during the Ukraine scandal. And so this is an actual picture of the representatives, including Adam Schiff, who led the impeachment, taking the articles of impeachment to the Senate. Now, one way that the White House can check the Congress is Congress can do a lot of work to put together these new laws, but if the president doesn't agree with the new law, or he or she feels that something is missing from the law, or maybe it simply goes against their interest, they have the power to veto that law, which means that they simply say no, or send it back to Congress, or throw it out. Now, there are ways to get around this veto, but it does tend to be pretty complicated. The next one we'll talk about is the relationship between the White House and the courts. So a power that the White House has over the Supreme Court is, as I mentioned, the Supreme Court cannot select their own justices. They can't hire justices. They can't try to get them by being elected through the people. They need to be hand-selected and appointed by the president, him or herself. In this case, you have Donald Trump, who is appointing Brett Kavanaugh. Now, one way that the Supreme Court checks the White House is that the Supreme Court, or rather, let's be very specific, the actual Chief Justice, which is, the lead justice in the Supreme Court, that person is the one that presides over an impeachment hearing. So, or rather an impeachment trial. So once the president has been impeached and they are in trial in the Senate, the Chief Justice can declare the acts of the White House as unconstitutional, and that will influence the vote of the Senate to either retain or remove the president. And then the final one is the relationship between Congress and the courts. So Congress has the power over the Supreme Court to control the cases that the Supreme Court will hear, and it can also impeach a judge for misconduct. Now, it's quite rare for Congress to impeach a Supreme Court justice. In fact, it's only happened one time, and it was 200 years ago with a justice that was nicknamed Old Bacon Face. The closest that we have come to that has been just recently, where Congress did not want to approve um, a person to become a Supreme Court justice, and this is him, Brett Kavanaugh, and it's because they found some sexual misconduct in his past. Nevertheless, he finally was appointed and is in the Supreme Court today. The check that the Supreme Court has over Congress is Congress can pump out a lot of different laws, and if the Supreme Court finds that they are unconstitutional, then that law is dismantled and something else gets put into place. So we saw this in the case of Brown versus the Board of Education, where separate but equal was completely legal, and the Supreme Court dismantled it during that case. So, in conclusion, this video was the structure of the US national government in a nutshell. I hope that it was informative, and I hope that the next time you're watching the news and hear about something that the government is doing, you have some context and you begin to understand what that event actually means. If you're interested in learning more about US government, click to subscribe to my channel, and thanks for watching.